welcome back to Peaky Boardgamer. My name is Rakos, and today I will teach you a game called Biblios Quill and Parchment, designed by Steve Finn. It's a game for 1 to 4 players and plays in under an hour. The original Biblios is probably my favorite filler game out there. The games are completely different. One uses cards and the other one is a roll and write game. One thing they share in common is that in both games, gameplay changes after mid-game. Let's move to the table and see this in detail. In the game, players take the role of monastic scribes trying to gain piety points. The game is played in rounds. In the first 4 rounds of the game, players will be rolling their dice, and then they use the dice in various ways. To send their novice on a journey, to perform good deeds, to copy books, and also to gain influence. After the 4th round, the game changes. Players will be bidding with their influence in order to gain the most valuable dice from a market. After the 8th round, the game ends and players will score piety points in many different categories. The player with the most piety points will win in Biblios Quill and Parchment. Each player takes a player card using the A side facing upwards, 1 marker, 3 book dice, 2 influence dice and 1 travel die. Place the monastery card in the middle of the table using the A side facing upwards again, and place the 5 value dice in the spaces corresponding to their color. The initial value of these dice is specific and is the one that I show you here, 43322. This is the embellishment die and should be placed on the purple space of the monastery card. This here is the temple. Using any random way, you have to draw the shapes depicted in the top left corner of the player's card in the bottom level of the temple from left to right. The space on the top is the altar space. The player whose shape is in a higher level than the others is regarded to be closer to the altar, and this will be used to break many ties in the game. If players that tie are in the same level, the ties are broken from left to right. So in our example, the player who is closer to the altar is the player with a square shape. The game is now ready to start. As I said in the overview, the game is split to 8 rounds. The first 4 rounds in the game play differently than the 4 last. I will start explaining the rules of the first 4 rounds. Each round is split in steps. In the first step, Plan the Day, all players roll simultaneously all of their dice. Then players count from 1 to 3, and on 3, all players simultaneously choose one of 3 different options using a hand gesture. By doing this, they choose to reroll all of their dice. By doing that, they choose to reroll only the selected die. Finally, by doing this, they select to keep their dice and stop rerolling. In any case, players may roll their dice maximum of 3 times, and if they choose to reroll 1 die, they can choose to reroll a different one next. Let's see this in action. One, 2, 3. One, 2, 3. In the second step, Perform Tasks, players use the result of their dice in various ways. At first, players add up the values of their 2 influence dice and write the result in the square space of the corresponding round. So in our example, the player should write 7 in the first square. Hexagonal spaces are used to keep a running total of all influence accumulated so far. So if the player gained 4 influence in the second round, they would write 11 influence in the hexagonal space. In the first period of the game, the 4 first rounds, players will be accumulating influence, which they're gonna be spending in the 4 last rounds. Then players use their book dice to copy books. If players have rolled any chapel results, this will be used in the third step. All the other book dice results correspond to a book type. For each result, player crosses out 1 book from the corresponding column, going from bottom to top. If a player crosses out the last book of a column, they gain a bonus. The first player to cross out the last book gains the 5-point bonus, the second one 3 and the third one 2. If multiple players cross out the last book of a specific column the same time, which player gains which bonus depends on which player is closer to the altar, remember? Now let's see how we use the travel die. The die depicts 1, 2 or 3 novice symbols. For each novice symbol, the player moves their novice one step onto this map. The starting point is the novice depicted in the bottom left corner of the map. Players can choose one of 2 different paths to start. I will choose the bottom path, so I will do 1 step, 2nd step, and I will circle the bonus in the 3rd step. There are bonuses like this one that depict one of the 5 book types. In this case, the player crosses out the next book in the corresponding column. If players circle the question mark bonus, they roll 1 more book die and then copy the corresponding book. If they roll a chapel, then they will deal with this in the 3rd step of the round. There are also some towns depicted onto this map. Players mostly are trying to reach those because they will gain victory points at the end of the game. Last but not least, there is one die result depicting a star. After the player performs 1 step on the map, they can choose any one of the 5 book types and cross out 1 more book. However, after the player chooses one of the book types, they must also cross out the star in the top of the column. If in the future the player rolls this result again, they may not choose the same book type. In the 3rd step, Go to Chapel, players use their chapel results to move to higher levels in the chapel, 1 level for each chapel result rolled. This is done in player order, starting with the player who is more far from the altar. So which player is that? It's the triangle player. The triangle player has 2 chapel results, so the player writes their symbols in the leftmost empty space of the next 2 levels. Next is the player with a circle. He has only 1 result, so we write a circle to the 2nd level. The player with a square has not rolled any chapel results and remains in the same level. Reaching higher levels in the chapel will grant players more victory points. As soon as a player reaches a level with a question mark, the player rolls another book die and gains the indicated result immediately. If a chapel is rolled, the player gains another level in the chapel immediately. After the 3rd step, you start a new round. After the end of the 4th round, it's the end of the 1st period, after which gameplay changes. On the main board, we see 4 rows of dice spaces. Yellow spaces are meant for book dice and brown spaces for travel dice. In the game you will use rows equal to the number of players starting from the top. So in our 3 players example, we will use the top 3 rows. So in our case we have 3 dice sets. In the 1st step of each round in period 2, players prepare the scriptorium. In this step, players roll each dice set separately and place the dice back on the board. Each player will choose and use one of the dice sets. Which player uses which set is gonna be determined by bidding with their influence in the 2nd step. In the next step, Appeal to the Abbot, players secretly bid an amount of influence in the square space of the current round. Players may not bid more than their remaining influence, and they can also bid 0. When all players are ready, they reveal their bids. Players then subtract their bid amount from their previous total, writing the result in the next hexagonal space. That will be their available influence for next round's bidding. Using the bidding order starting with the highest bidder, each player will select one of the dice sets and use them as well. In case there is a tie in bidding, the tie will be broken again depending on which player is closer to the altar. Players will use their dice exactly the same way we explained earlier. However, each one of the rows also grants the player with a specific bonus. The 1st row bonus is that the player may use also the result of the embellishment die. The embellishment die depicts plus and minus symbols. For each one of these symbols, the player must increase or must decrease the value of any one die. In our example with the 2 plus signs, the player must increase the value of 2 different dice or the value of 1 die twice. The 2nd row bonus is that the player may change the result of one of their dice to a chapel result. The 3rd row bonus is that the player will add 1 more movement to the result of the travel die. And the bonus of the last draw, only used in a 4-player game, is that the player may re-roll one of the 2 book dice and they must keep the new result. After this step, players move to the next round. A last rule that applies in all periods is that whenever players may not use their book or travel dice, either because they have completed a book column or if they have traveled everywhere on the map, for each die they cannot use, players choose either to move 1 step with their novice, which is not applicable now, or perform a good deed by filling one of the spaces on the cross. In this specific case, the player would have to fill 2 spaces on the cross. There is no alternative. After the end of the 8th round, the game ends and players gain piety points in different categories. Let's start from the top. In the brown space, players add up all their book bonus values. The purple space has to do with the map. Players gain 2, 5 or 10 points for reaching 1, 2 or 3 towns respectively. The player has reached all 3 towns and gains 10 victory points. In the light brown space, players gain piety points depending on their remaining influence after they divide it with 4 and rounding down. This player gains 3 piety points. In the blue space, players multiply their good deeds with 2, so the player gains 4 piety points. In the green space, players gain piety points depending on the level they reached in the chapel. As you can see, the level reached by the circle player will grant only 1 point. The triangle player will gain 6 and the square player will gain 3 in this category. Last we have the scoring of books. For each one of the book categories, players are ranked according to who has the most books. If more than 1 players have completed the same column, then the player who has gained the better bonus is regarded to have more books. In our example, these are the ranks of this player in each one of the book types. A player who is ranked first in a category will gain 3 times the value of the corresponding die color in piety points. So the player gains 9 points in the pink category. If you are ranked second, you gain 2 times the value of the die. So 2 points here. If you are ranked third, you gain 1 time the value of the die, so the player gains 2 victory points here as well. The player is also third in this category, gaining 4 victory points. In a 4-player game, ranking 4th grants the player half the value of the die, rounding down. This is not applicable in our game. Finally, if a player did not manage to reach a level with a minus number, then regardless the player's ranking, the player will score the minus points depicted on the space. Here minus 1 point. So we have a total of 16 points in this category. Players tally up their score in the top square. The player with the most piety points is declared the winner. In case of a tie, the tied player who is closer to the altar wins the game. Now I will explain the differences in a 2-player game. The 2-player game requires the use of a third neutral player. So, the neutral player uses a player card and also 3 book dice. You also keep track of the neutral player's position in the chapel. Initially, you write the neutral player's symbol in the leftmost space in the chapel. In the first period, before the first step of each round, so before players roll their dice, you roll the neutral player's book dice first, which are used immediately. If the neutral player rolls a chapel result, it will be kept for step 3 as normal. Whenever the neutral player cannot use one of the dice, you keep re-rolling the die until you have a result that can be used. In the second period, you set up the board as normal, as if for a 3-player game. The neutral player never bids. After players reveal their bids, if the higher bidder has bid more than double of the lower bidder influence, then after selecting the preferred set, the higher bidder also selects a set for the neutral player. But if the bid was not more than the double, then after the first player selects a set, the second player selects one of the sets and leaves the last one for the neutral player. The neutral player never uses the travel die and also any of the bonuses, only keeps track of books. The neutral player does not score points. The neutral player mainly affects the ranking of other players in the scoring of book types. And that were all the rules for the new Biblios Quill and Parchment. If you like our videos and want to see more, please subscribe to my channel, and until next time, have fun and play more board games.